I want to tell you something that may disturb you at first, something that disturbed me greatly when I finally understood it, after decades of studying the work of Carl Jung. What if your suffering wasn't random? What if the hardships you've endured, the things that seem so unfair, so cruel, so unnecessary, what if they were not obstacles to your becoming who you're meant to be, but the very path itself? Jung spent 60 years investigating the depths of the human psyche, and he arrived at a conclusion that contradicts almost everything our culture tells us about pain and difficulty. He discovered that there is a kind of suffering that destroys us, and another kind that creates us. And most people, through no fault of their own, spend their entire lives running from the second while drowning in the first. Let me explain what he found. Now, I want to be very careful here. I am not about to tell you that your pain was meant to be in some simplistic greeting card sense. That would be an insult to what you've endured. What I'm going to share with you is far more interesting and far more useful. You see, most of us carry around a particular kind of ache. It's the ache of looking back at our lives and seeing how hard things have been. Perhaps you had a childhood that required you to grow up too fast. Perhaps you loved someone who could not love you back. Perhaps you've struggled with your mind, your body, your circumstances, in ways that others around you seem to be spared. And you've asked yourself, I know you have, because I asked myself the same question for years. Why? Why me? Why so difficult? Jung asked this question too, and not only for his patients, but for himself. He went through what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, years of psychological turmoil that nearly broke him. And what he discovered during that dark period became the foundation of everything I'm about to share with you. He discovered that the psyche is not a passive thing that simply receives experiences. The psyche is active, it is purposeful, and it has an aim that our conscious mind often cannot see and frequently fights against. Jung came to believe that there is an intelligence within you. He sometimes called it the self, with a capital S, that is trying to make you whole. Not happy, necessarily, not comfortable, but whole, complete, individuated. And here is the difficult truth. The path to wholeness almost always runs through difficulty, and it runs through exactly the kind of difficulty you have faced. In 1938, Jung wrote something that stopped me in my tracks when I first read it. He wrote, and I quote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." Let me unpack this, because it contains one of the most important distinctions you will ever encounter. Jung recognized that there are two fundamentally different kinds of suffering. The first kind, what he called legitimate suffering, is the suffering that life genuinely requires of us. It's the grief when someone we love dies. It's the pain of confronting truths about ourselves we'd rather not see. It's the difficulty of leaving behind an old identity that no longer fits. It's the struggle of creating something meaningful. It's the heartbreak of relationships that teach us what we need to learn. And this suffering has a purpose. It is hard, genuinely hard, but it leads somewhere. It breaks us open so that something new can grow. But the second kind of suffering, what Jung called neurotic suffering, this is something entirely different. Neurotic suffering is what happens when we refuse the legitimate suffering, when we run from the grief, suppress the difficult truth, cling to the old identity, avoid the meaningful struggle, refuse the lessons of relationship. And here is the cruel irony that Jung observed in patient after patient, year after year. When we refuse the legitimate suffering because it seems too hard, too painful, too unfair, we do not escape suffering. We simply exchange one form of suffering for another. And the neurotic suffering we create by avoidance is almost always worse than the legitimate suffering we were trying to escape. The anxiety that won't go away, the depression that settles over everything, the addictions that numb us, the relationships that keep failing in the same ways, the sense that something is fundamentally wrong, but we can't name what it is, the feeling of being haunted by something. This is neurotic suffering, and Jung saw that it was always a substitute for some legitimate suffering the person was refusing to face. Now, what does this have to do with why your life has been so hard? Consider this possibility. Some of the hardships you've faced, the ones that felt so unfair at the time, and were the psyche's way of placing you directly in front of legitimate suffering that you needed to face in order to grow. Not suffering you deserved, suffering you needed. The universe was not punishing you. Something within you was trying to develop you. Jung was fascinated by mythology, not because he saw myths as primitive superstition, but because he recognized them as maps of psychological territory. The same archetypal stories appear across cultures and centuries because they describe experiences common to all human beings. One of the most important of these archetypal patterns he called the night sea journey, or in Greek, the nekia, the descent to the underworld. You know this story, even if you've never heard its name. It's Jonah being swallowed by the whale and spending 3 days in darkness before being cast up on the shore and transformed. It's the Egyptian sun god Ra traveling through the underworld each night, battling serpents in the darkness, only to be reborn at dawn. It's Persephone descending to Hades. It's Orpheus going down to retrieve what he loved and lost. It's your story too. I suspect you know exactly what I mean. There are periods in our lives, sometimes long periods, when we feel swallowed by something, when the light goes out, when we are in a kind of psychological underworld, and we don't know if we will ever emerge. Jung would say, this is not a malfunction. This is not evidence that something has gone wrong. This is the night sea journey, and it is the only path to certain kinds of transformation. You see, the ego, our conscious sense of self, the I we think we are, has limitations. There are truths it cannot access, incapacities it cannot develop, forms of wisdom it cannot attain, except by being defeated, except by going through what feels like death. Jung wrote in Mysterium Conjunctionis, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. The self, that deeper center Jung spoke of, cannot emerge into consciousness without the ego first being humbled, broken open, forced to surrender its illusion of control. What I want you to understand is that the dark periods of your life, the times when you felt lost, overwhelmed, swallowed by circumstances or by your own mind, these may have been night sea journeys. You were not being destroyed. You were being transformed, even when, especially when, it felt like destruction. And the depth of that darkness, the intensity of that difficulty, yes, it was proportional to the transformation that was being worked in you. Jung put it more poetically in a passage from Ion that I return to again and again. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The height to which you can grow is directly related to the depth you have been willing to descend. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and speak to you directly. If what I've been describing resonates with you, if you recognize your own experience in this pattern of night sea journeys and legitimate suffering, then I suspect we have something in common. We are people who have been through the depths, who have asked the hard questions, who want to understand our experience, not just survive it. This channel exists to explore these ideas. Carl Jung's psychology, the path of individuation, the making sense of a life that often seems senseless. If you'd like to continue this exploration together, I invite you to subscribe, not because the numbers matter to me. I'm an old man. I have no interest in such things, but because these ideas deserve to be preserved and shared, and each person who joins helps us do that. Now, let me show you where all of this leads. There's one more piece of this puzzle that Jung revealed, and it may be the most important of all. It concerns what your suffering has made you capable of. In Greek mythology, there was a centaur named Chiron. He was the wisest of all centaurs, a great teacher of heroes. He taught Achilles, Hercules, Asclepius. But Chiron carried an incurable wound. He had been accidentally struck by a poisoned arrow, and because he was immortal, he could not die, but neither could he be healed. He lived with constant pain, and yet, because of that wound, Chiron became the greatest healer. His suffering gave him access to a depth of understanding and compassion that no unwounded being could possess. Jung saw this archetype operating everywhere in human life. He called it the wounded healer. Listen carefully. Your wound, the suffering you have endured, is not just something that happened to you. It is something that has happened in you. It has created capacities in you. Capacities for understanding, for compassion, for seeing what others cannot see. Jung wrote in his essays on psychotherapy, and I'll never forget these words: a good half of every treatment that probes at all deeply consists in the doctor's examining himself. It is his own hurt that gives the measure of his power to heal. It is his own hurt that gives the measure of his power to heal. Not his training, not his credentials, his hurt. Think about the people in your own life who have helped you most. Were they the ones who had easy lives, who had never struggled? Or were they the ones who had been through something themselves, who recognized your pain because they knew pain? Your suffering has given you something. I don't know exactly what. Each wound creates its own unique gift, but something has been built in you that could not have been built any other way. Perhaps you now understand a certain kind of pain from the inside, and you can be present with others who experience that pain in a way that no one who hasn't been there could be. Perhaps you have developed a sensitivity, a perception, a way of seeing through surfaces to deeper truths. Perhaps you have a hard-won wisdom about what actually matters in life, what is real and what is pretense. Your wound has qualified you for something. The question is not whether, the question is what. So what do we do with all of this? How do we move from understanding to integration? Jung offered one clear directive that encompasses all of his practical advice. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Disagreeable and therefore not popular. Jung had a gift for understatement. The work is this: stop running from the legitimate suffering and start learning from it. This means different things for different people, but let me offer 3 questions you might sit with. First, what suffering have I been avoiding that keeps returning in neurotic forms? What grief have I not grieved? What truth have I not faced? What necessary ending have I refused to accept? Second, what has my hardship taught me? What capacities has it developed in me that I might not have developed otherwise? Where is the wound becoming a gift? And third, who might I be able to serve, to heal, to help, to accompany, precisely because of what I have been through? These are not questions to answer quickly. They are questions to live with, to return to let work on you over time. And I want to remind you, this is not about pretending your suffering was pleasant, or convincing yourself that it was all for the best. Some of what you've been through was genuinely terrible, and you're allowed to know that. What Jung offers is not toxic positivity. He offers something much more interesting, the possibility that even terrible things can be used, that the psyche is alchemical. It can transmute base material into gold if we cooperate with the process rather than fighting it. I want to leave you with one final thought. Jung lived until he was 85 years old. Near the end of his life, he was asked whether life was meaningful, and he answered, I'm paraphrasing, but this was the essence. I don't know whether it is meaningful, but I know that it feels meaningful. It feels as though it makes sense. After everything he had been through, after witnessing the suffering of thousands of patients, after descending into his own psychological underworld and nearly not emerging, Jung still said, it feels like it makes sense. Your life has been hard. I don't know exactly how or why, but I know it has been, because life is hard, and some lives are harder than others. And you've wondered why. You've carried that question, perhaps for a very long time. What I hope you take from our time together today is this. You may have been carrying the wrong question. The question was, never why did this happen to me? The question is, what is being asked of me? What am I being shaped into? What will I do with what I've been given? Your wound is real. Your suffering is real. And they have made you capable of things you could never have been capable of otherwise. That, my friend, is the hidden reason your life had to be so hard. Until next time.